The first light of dawn crept into the Halston plantation kitchen, spilling pale gold across the soot-stained brick walls. Brutus was already awake. He had not slept. Sleep was a luxury that visited men with peace of mind, not those bound to the iron rhythm of chains and orders. The air was thick with the familiar scent of lard, ash, and smoke. Every morning smelled the same, yet it struck him like the opening note of a hymn to suffering. He stood by the long wooden table, scarred from years of chopping, kneading, and carving. The calluses on his hands matched those scars, deep, uneven, and permanent. Behind him, the fire cracked as if mocking his silence. Copper pots hung above his head, each one shining dully in the faint light. They reflected his face, distorted, fragmented, divided like his life had been since he first stepped foot on this land. "Faster, Brutus," barked the overseer from the doorway. "Sun ain't waited for nobody yet." Brutus didn't answer. He didn't have to. His hands spoke faster than words, slicing fat back, tossing cornmeal, stirring gravy. The overseer left satisfied, boots thudding up the hallway toward the laughter of the white folks upstairs. That laughter seeped through the floorboards like smoke through cracks. It haunted the kitchen, mingling with the clang of ladles and the low moans of the enslaved workers beginning their day. Brutus's thoughts, however, were not on the food. They were on the girl who would soon walk through that narrow door with sleepy eyes and braided hair, his daughter, Ilara. She arrived moments later, barefoot, a faded blue dress brushing her ankles. The color was once vibrant, like the sky before a storm, but the sun and soap had drained it pale. She carried a bucket of water in both hands, her small frame trembling from the weight. Brutus's eyes softened, though his face stayed carved in stone. He wanted to smile, to say good morning, but even that felt dangerous. Words could draw attention. Attention drew punishment. She placed the bucket down. "Mornin', Pa," she whispered. He nodded once. The word Pa was a forbidden sweetness. No one called him that but her, and only here when no white ears were near. He reached for the flour sack and poured it into a bowl, his movements steady, rhythmic, almost holy. "Fetch the sugar," he murmured under his breath. Ilara obeyed, climbing onto a stool to reach the upper shelf. The room filled with the quiet symphony of work wooden spoons scraping bowls, firewood cracking, the soft rush of steam. For a moment, Brutus could almost pretend this was life, not labor. But his eyes drifted to the iron shackles hanging by the back door, old, rusted, but never forgotten. They weren't for cooking, they were reminders, a display of what happened to those who forgot their place. He remembered when they'd first brought him here, nearly 15 years ago. Back then, his hands were strong and his heart still believed in freedom. He'd cooked for soldiers in the war before being captured and sold south. The Halstons discovered his skill by accident when he turned a pot of spoiled pork into a meal the mistress called divine. From that day on, he was no longer just a slave. He was the cook. The irony of that title still burned. To be praised for what he made with his hands, while those same hands were owned. The mistress, a pale, stern woman who wore lace gloves even in the heat, had once told him, "Brutus, you have a gift from God. You should be grateful you can use it here." He'd bowed his head and said, "Yes, ma'am." Inside, he'd thought, "God didn't give me this gift for you." The kitchen door creaked. 2 field hands entered, dragging sacks of cornmeal and barrels of molasses. They greeted him with tired nods. In the unspoken hierarchy of bondage, Brutus held a strange position, neither free nor fully beaten. The other slaves respected him because he'd survived so long, because he could look a white man in the eye for half a second longer than most before bowing. But survival wasn't the same as living. It was just a slower kind of dying. He kneaded the dough for biscuits, pressing his fists into the pliant mass, sweat rolling down his temples. Every press was a memory, the first whipping he took for speaking out, the night he heard his wife's cries from the quarters before she was sold, the day he realized Ilara was all he had left. His life had been boiled down like stew. Every joy simmered away until only bitterness remained. Upstairs, the master's voice thundered, commanding the house staff. "Mr." Halston's words rolled like thunder through the rafters. "Make it grand today. The governor's man might dine with us. Tell that cook to prepare his best." Brutus didn't need to be told. He already knew how to make grand. He could make flavors that made men smile without knowing they were tasting their own cruelty seasoned with his hate. He glanced at Ilara again. She was humming softly, cleaning the counter with a rag, unaware of the heavy gaze of the past watching her. For a brief moment, Brutus's chest filled with something like pride. She had her mother's gentleness, but her eyes were his, deep, solemn, and burning with something dangerous, awareness. The kitchen door opened once more, and the young Halston son, Robert, stepped in. His boots were polished, his smile sharp. The air thickened immediately. "Morning, Brutus," he said, voice smooth like butter over rot. "Pa says you'll be making the cake when the wedding day comes. You best make it fine. My sister deserves perfection." "Yes, sir," Brutus said, his tone flat. Robert's gaze slid to Ilara. He smirked. "You've raised a pretty helper. You keep her close now, you hear? Wouldn't want her wandering the house." Brutus's jaw clenched. "She stays where she's told, sir." Robert lingered, enjoying the silence that followed. The boy's arrogance filled the room like smoke. Finally, he left, slamming the door behind him. Ilara looked shaken. Brutus turned his back to her, hiding the storm behind his face. His fists tightened around the knife handle until his knuckles went white. One day, he thought, one day this kitchen will serve justice. The morning stretched into noon. Pans hissed, oil popped, and the air grew heavy with scent roasted ham, cornbread, onions caramelizing in butter. Brutus moved like a shadow, everywhere at once, commanding the small space with the authority of a king who owned nothing but his sorrow. When the food was ready, it was carried upstairs on silver trays, offered to laughter he would never share. When the kitchen finally emptied, Brutus sat down on the small stool near the hearth. The fire was dying, orange embers glowing softly. Ilara brought him a tin cup of water. He drank slowly, eyes unfocused, lost in thought. She asked quietly, "Pa, you ever think about leaving?" He looked at her, the weight of generations in his eyes. "Ain't nowhere to go, child," he said. "They just find me, bring me back, or worse. Freedom don't come from running. It come from what a man leaves behind." Ilara frowned. "What you mean?" He smiled faintly, though it was a tired, haunted smile. "You'll know when the time's right." Outside, the plantation bells rang. Another day had begun above their heads, and another ended below them. Brutus rose, stretching his back. The scent of the next meal awaited. The endless cycle continued, but deep within him, something small and cold had begun to stir. It wasn't hope, it was purpose. The kind that smoldered, silent as the coals beneath the stove, waiting, patient, for the right flame. The morning sun spilled gold across the Virginia hills, painting the Halston plantation in deceptive serenity. The mansion stood like a proud relic of pride itself, columns gleaming white, verandas trimmed in ivy, and voices of laughter that fluttered through the air like mockingbirds. To the passerby, it was a place of charm and gentility. But beneath that charm, in the earth and in the walls, misery whispered like a hidden hymn. Inside the kitchen, the rhythm of servitude had already begun. Brutus stirred a pot of simmering broth, his movements slow, deliberate, the spoon scraping the bottom of the pot with a dull rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Around him, the younger slaves hurried washing vegetables, slicing bread, scrubbing pots. The air smelled of yeast and smoke, of survival wrapped in obedience. Then came the sound, sharp, sudden, and foreign to their morning routine. The clanging of the mansion bell. It was the master's signal for assembly. Conversations froze. Even the fire seemed to hush. Brutus exchanged a glance with one of the older maids, Ruth, who muttered under her breath, "Ain't good when that bell rings so early." He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped to the doorway that looked into the hallway beyond. From upstairs came the heavy tread of boots and the faint laughter of the Halston family. He knew that laugh, boisterous, proud, untouched by consequence. The slaves gathered in the courtyard, rows forming like lines in a field, their eyes downcast but their ears sharp. Mr. Halston emerged on the veranda, his paunch straining against his waistcoat, a cigar glowing between his fingers. His wife, in her lace shawl, stood beside him with a smile that looked like it had been painted there. And just behind them, the young bride-to-be, Miss Caroline Halston, stood glowing in white silk, her blonde hair bound with ribbons. She was 20, maybe 21, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that only came from being born on the right side of the whip. "My good people, Mr." Halston's voice boomed, echoing through the open air. "Today marks a blessed day in our family. My daughter Caroline is to be wed next month to the fine gentleman, Mr. Henry Lowell, of Richmond." The courtyard erupted in forced cheers. Slaves clapped, some whistled softly, others just mouthed sounds, careful not to appear ungrateful. It was a performance they'd mastered happiness under watch. "Mr. Halston continued, puffing on his cigar, "It will be the grandest wedding this county has ever seen. The governor himself may attend, and I want everything to be perfect. Perfect. The food, the flowers, the music, everything shall reflect the Halston name." He pointed his cigar toward the kitchen door. Brutus. Brutus stepped forward, head slightly bowed, heart steady. Yes, sir. You'll be in charge of the feast. The entire menu, every dish, every course. You've served this family well. Don't fail me now. I won't, sir. I want a cake, the master added, turning to his daughter with a grin. A grand one, fit for royalty, white sugar, fine cream, maybe a touch of imported chocolate. You'll see to it, Brutus. You understand? Yes, sir, Brutus said again, though the word understand cut deeper than intended. He understood far too much. Caroline smiled, stepping closer to her father. He's the best cook in the county, Papa. Everyone says so. Her tone was light, kind even, but her kindness was the kind that looked down from above. She glanced at Brutus briefly, her blue eyes flicking over him like he was another fine dish to be arranged. Make something sweet, she said. Something everyone will remember. Brutus bowed his head again. Yes, miss. They left soon after, laughter and plans echoing into the parlor. The courtyard dispersed. The slaves went back to their tasks, the illusion of joy fading as quickly as it had been summoned. Ruth shook her head as she carried a basket of onions inside. Ain't nothing good ever comes from them big gatherings, she muttered. In the kitchen, Brutus returned to his pot, though the broth had gone cold. Ilara appeared again, carrying folded linens from the house. Her eyes were wary. What's all the fuss, Pa? He glanced at her, voice low. The wedding. Miss Caroline getting married. Ilara's face tightened. To that man from Richmond? Brutus nodded. He'd seen Lowell once before, a young white man with fine clothes and cruel eyes. The kind who laughed too loudly and drank too much, who saw people like Brutus and Ilara as decorations in his grand life. When's it happening? She asked. Next month. Ilara looked down at her hands. They're going to work us harder than ever. Brutus didn't reply. He knew she was right. For the next weeks, the plantation would buzz with preparation, extra chores, endless cleaning, sleepless nights. The mansion would be painted, the gardens replanted, the silver polished until it blinded the poor souls carrying it. Every ounce of misery would be disguised under the veneer of celebration. But beneath that surface, Brutus felt something stir, a slow, heavy pulse that had nothing to do with exhaustion. He could almost taste the irony. He would prepare a feast for the very people who had turned his life into ashes. He would bake joy for those who had stolen his own. The thought made his hands tremble, not with fear, but something deeper. Resentment aged like wine. His had been fermenting for years. Later that afternoon, he walked through the garden to the smokehouse, passing groups of slaves repairing fences and trimming hedges. The air was thick with humidity and tension. Snatches of conversation followed him, fragments of weary disbelief. Reckon they'll give us any rest after this? Rest? They'll work us straight through the night. Lord, I just hope the girl don't end up like the mistress, cold and cruel. Brutus said nothing, but the words weighed heavy. He stepped inside the smokehouse, where strips of salted pork hung from hooks, glistening in the dim light. The smell of brine and ash filled his lungs. He picked up a slab, running his fingers over the rough surface, and felt a strange calm wash over him. Here, in the quiet, he could think. He thought of Ilara, of the way she flinched when Robert passed near, the way her eyes darted toward doors before entering a room. He thought of the night his wife was sold, of the promise he'd whispered to himself that he'd protect his daughter, no matter the cost. But the world offered no mercy to men like him. Protection, in this place, was an illusion. As he prepared the next day's meats, the master's laughter echoed faintly from the veranda. The sound threaded through the air, twisting, mocking, until it reached his ears like a curse. Brutus set down his knife and stared at his reflection in a pan of water beside him. For a moment, he didn't see the weary cook, the obedient servant. He saw a man hollowed out and waiting. He wiped his hands, stood tall, and stepped outside. The evening sun bathed the fields in red light, and the cicadas screamed their endless song. From the house came the faint melody of a piano, Caroline practicing some genteel tune for her wedding day. Its delicate notes drifted across the air like sugar dissolving in poison. Ilara appeared again, carrying a tray back to the kitchen. She paused beside him, sensing his silence. You think they happy, Pa? Them folks? Brutus's voice came low, steady, almost whispering. Happiness built on another man's chains don't last long. He looked back toward the mansion, where laughter spilled like light through open windows. His reflection in the glass was small, distorted, almost invisible. But inside that invisible man, a spark had been born. Something was coming. He didn't yet know its shape or its method, but it had already begun quiet as a thought, steady as a heartbeat, and one day soon, house that demanded perfection from him would taste perfection of another kind. The evening air carried the faint sweetness of magnolia and smoke from the kitchen hearths. Brutus moved through the house in silence, his apron folded neatly at his waist, his hands polished from years of kneading dough and scrubbing copper pots. He had long ago learned to move like a shadow through the corridors of the Ashford home unnoticed, unseen, a man made invisible by obedience. But that night something in the air was wrong. There was laughter coming from the parlor high, tinkling laughter, the kind that dripped of wine and privilege. Caroline Ashford was entertaining guests again. She had turned 21 that spring and carried herself now with the careless confidence of someone who believed the world would always bend to her whims. Brutus had watched her grow from the cruel child who set fire to his world into a woman adored by every man who crossed her path. He'd seen the same smile she'd worn that night of fire, now polished, trained, and deadly melt hearts and silence rooms. Master James Ashford had instructed Brutus to prepare desserts for Caroline's supper gathering. The dining table glittered with crystal glasses and silver, the candlelight reflected in polished wood. He laid the final dish before her, a peach cobbler, golden and fragrant, and stepped back. Caroline's hand brushed his wrist as she reached for the serving spoon, a brief, deliberate touch that made his muscles tighten. "You've outdone yourself again, Brutus," she said with that lilting tone that always sounded like praise but felt like mockery. "Papa says you could cook for kings." "Thank you, Miss Caroline," he murmured, eyes fixed on the table. When the guests left later that night, laughter still echoing through the halls, Brutus lingered in the kitchen, cleaning the dishes long after the other servants had gone to bed. His hands worked mechanically, but his mind churned with memories of that night 14 years ago, the screams, the heat, the light of that broken lamp in Caroline's hand. Every clatter of a dish was a reminder of something stolen from him. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Caroline stepped inside, barefoot, holding her skirts slightly off the floor. "You're still awake," she said. Brutus straightened, startled. "Yes, miss, I was just finishing up." She smiled faintly, but there was a peculiar light in her eyes, something sharp and unkind. "You never sleep much, do you? Always working?" "Always so. Faithful." Brutus swallowed. "It's my duty, miss." She moved closer, the scent of her perfume roses and something sharper beneath filling the air. "My father says you're the most loyal man he's ever owned." The words landed like a blow. Owned. He had heard it his entire life, but from her lips it cut deeper. Caroline circled him slowly, her silk gown brushing against his sleeve. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "that night so long ago, when your little cabin burned?" His hands froze over the basin. For a moment he couldn't breathe. "I remember, miss." Her smile didn't fade. "I was so young then. Clumsy. Foolish. Papa says I've grown since." Brutus turned slightly, meeting her gaze, a dangerous thing for a man in his position to do. "Yes, miss, you've grown." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And you've never forgiven me, have you?" The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any accusation. "I have no right to forgiveness or anger," he said, forcing each word past the tightness in his throat. "Only to serve." She leaned closer until he could see the pale shimmer of her skin in the lamplight. "You lie beautifully, Brutus." He stepped back, his hand brushing the counter behind him, gripping the edge to steady himself. Something inside him began to fracture a pressure, building slowly over years of silence. He wanted to scream the truth, to tell her what her laughter had done, how it had turned every breath since into an act of survival. But his chains were invisible and unbreakable, forged not of iron but of fear. She reached out and placed a hand against his chest, not gentle, not kind, but curious, like a child testing the heat of a flame. "You have a heartbeat," she murmured. "I wondered if you still did." Brutus turned away sharply, his jaw locked. "Miss Caroline, please." "Please what?" she said, her tone sharp now, mocking. "Please remember your place." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not beauty or cruelty, but something hollow. Caroline Ashford, adored by all, feared by none, was nothing more than a spoiled ghost haunting a house built on bones. "You should go, miss," he said quietly. "Your father wouldn't want you in the kitchen at this hour." For a moment she hesitated, then smiled, slow and poisonous. "No, I suppose he wouldn't." She turned, gathering her skirt. "Good night, Brutus. Sweet dreams, if you still have them." When she was gone, the silence in the kitchen felt heavier than before. Brutus leaned against the counter, his hands trembling. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The line between master and servant, between memory and present, had blurred beyond recognition. He felt a cold clarity settle in his chest, the certainty that Caroline Ashford could never be redeemed, that whatever humanity she once possessed had burned away long ago with his family's bodies. He stepped out into the yard, the night air biting against his skin. The fields stretched dark and endless beyond the cabins, and above them the stars flickered like distant witnesses. He thought of Celia's laugh, of Samuel's small hands, of Ruth's first steps on the packed earth floor. He thought of the years he had spent surviving when he should have died with them. Inside the big house, a window glowed faintly, Caroline's room. He stared at it until the flame inside guttered out. In that moment, Brutus knew there would be no peace in life, no justice in law, no forgiveness in heaven. The world would never right itself, not on its own. If divine justice refused to descend, he would bring it forth with his own hands. The cook, the servant, the obedient man, all of that ended in the darkness outside the Ashford home. What remained was a quiet, methodical resolve. Tomorrow he would begin collecting the final ingredients for a new recipe, one that would balance the scales of every wrong ever done to him. As the wind rustled through the trees, he whispered their names: Celia, Samuel, Ruth. For the first time in 14 years, the words didn't tremble. They steadied him like a prayer. Dawn in Virginia came slow and amber, crawling through the mist that hung over the tobacco fields like breath on glass. Brutus stood before the kitchen window, the first light catching the iron pots and the copper bowls that lined the shelves. The house still slept, but the world outside was already alive. The rustle of the overseer's whip, the grunt of mules, the shuffle of bare feet on dew-soaked soil. It was another day of labor, another cycle of silence. But for Brutus, dawn no longer meant servitude. It meant patience. 14 years had passed since the night his world burned. 14 years of ash settling in his lungs and forgiveness turning to rust. In that time, the Ashfords had grown wealthier. Their fields had doubled. Their reputation spread through Richmond and beyond. They were admired for their hospitality, for the feasts Caroline hosted, for the fine hand of their cook. Brutus's dishes were spoken of with reverence by men who would not meet his eyes. Every bite they took, every praise they uttered, was another stitch in the quiet tapestry he was weaving, one made not of thread but of intent. He cooked for them, smiled for them, bowed for them all, while a slow fire smoldered beneath his ribs. He became more than a cook. He was a craftsman, an artist of precision. He studied herbs and roots, not just for flavor but for power. He learned from healers on neighboring plantations, from field hands who whispered of plants that killed pain and those that killed men. He kept what he learned hidden, buried under layers of servitude. To them, he was obedient, dull, predictable. To himself, he was gathering kindling. There were moments in those 14 years that tested him, times when rage clawed at his resolve, when Caroline laughed in the garden and he saw the same tilt of her head, the same spark of cruelty, when Master Ashford, growing older and slower, would clap his shoulder after a meal and say, "You're my finest investment, Brutus." Each insult, each touch became another ember, but he never let it show. He built his plans slowly, like a recipe meant to simmer for years. It began with trust. He made himself indispensable. He never forgot a request, never raised his voice, never faltered in his duties. When Caroline's mother fell ill, it was Brutus who prepared her soups. When Caroline married her first marriage, brief and hollow, he catered the ceremony himself. And when her husband died of fever not a year later, it was Brutus who cooked the wake's meal, silent and steady. He did not yet know it then, but that night, the first time he saw Caroline in widow's black, something changed. Her cruelty had softened, replaced by restlessness. The world was no longer enough for her. She wanted admiration, spectacle, devotion. She turned her father's estate into a theatre for her charm. Dinners became grander, guests more powerful. And through it all, Brutus served at her right hand, the silent ghost in every celebration. By 1858, the whispers began that Caroline Ashford would marry again. This time, the suitor was from Charleston, a wealthy trader named Thomas Redding. The match promised to unite two great families, their fortunes and influence spreading across state lines. The wedding would be the grandest the county had seen. When Brutus heard, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The years of waiting had coiled into this single moment. Fate, it seemed, had set the table. That spring, he began preparing his masterpiece. No one noticed the changes, how he requested certain imported ingredients, how he spent long hours perfecting a new recipe. The kitchen boys thought it was simply the pressure of the upcoming wedding. Caroline herself praised his diligence, unaware of the precision with which he measured every drop and grain. But even as his plan solidified, a sliver of doubt pierced him in the quiet hours. Sometimes he would pause mid-chop, his knife hovering over the cutting board, and see their faces, Celia's laughter, Samuel's eyes, Ruth's small hands clutching his shirt. Would vengeance bring peace, or would it chain him to the same cruelty that had forged his pain? He did not know. He only knew that forgiveness had no place left to grow in this soil. Each night, after the others had gone to their quarters, he stayed behind to tend the kitchen garden. Beneath the rows of mint and thyme, he hid a small patch his own. There, among the shadows, grew the plants the others feared: foxglove, oleander, nightshade. Their leaves glistened under the moonlight like secret tongues. He handled them with reverence, careful not to breathe too close. As he worked, his mind drifted to the story of Prometheus, which one of the house tutors had once recited aloud in the parlor. A god who gave fire to men, punished for his defiance. Brutus had lingered in the doorway that day, listening unseen. "It is the curse of the rebel," the tutor had said, "to suffer for bringing light." 14 years later, Brutus understood. His fire was not rebellion, it was reckoning. Summer thickened, heavy with cicadas and heat. Caroline's wedding drew near, the house filled with seamstresses, decorators, and guests. Laughter and music bled into every corner. Brutus moved among them unnoticed, his presence as familiar as the creak of the kitchen door. But within, he counted every day like a soldier waiting for battle. One evening, he found himself standing before the mirror in the pantry, an old, warped thing that barely reflected him straight. His face looked older than his years, lined and tired. His eyes, once bright, had sunk into shadow. He saw not a man, but the reflection of everything the Ashfords had made him, their labor, their grief, their ghost. He whispered, "Soon." That night, a storm broke over the plantation. Rain battered the windows and thunder rolled across the hills. Brutus sat alone by the dying fire, listening to the house groan in the wind. For a fleeting moment, he thought he heard Ruth's laughter in the storm, high and pure, like it had been before the fire. He smiled faintly, tears cutting clean paths through the soot on his cheeks. "Wait a little longer," he murmured to the ghosts that lived in his heart. "Your justice is coming." The thunder answered like distant drums. Outside, the rain washed over the earth, cleansing nothing. Inside, Brutus's fire burned on quiet, patient and eternal. Morning broke golden over the Ashford plantation, the sun sliding through mist that clung to the fields like gauze over an old wound. From the kitchen door, Brutus watched the light spread across the land, touching the white columns of the house. The willow trees bowed beside the road, the rows of tables being erected for the wedding guests. The world looked polished and harmless in the dawn, as if it had forgotten what it had done. Inside, the kitchen roared alive. Pots hissed, knives flashed, and the air was heavy with spice and sweat. Brutus moved through it like a conductor guiding an orchestra, his motions quiet, certain, and exact. He had spent weeks rehearsing this day in his mind. The timing of every dish, the placement of every platter, the sequence of every course. The servants around him, young men and women half his age, watched for his cues. None spoke unless he nodded. "Keep the fires even," he murmured to one boy at the stove. "If the smoke burns the meat, Miss Caroline will taste it before the guests do." The boy nodded, terrified to disappoint him. Brutus no longer needed to raise his voice. His authority had become instinctive. Even the overseer respected him, for in this house, a ruined meal could bring the master's temper down faster than a missed harvest. On a side table lay a ledger his own, bound in worn leather. Inside, every recipe was written in a fine, disciplined hand: roasts, puddings, pies, sauces. It was the diary of his servitude, each page a year of his life measured in ounces and minutes. Today he turned to a clean page. Across the top he wrote in slow, deliberate strokes: "Wedding cake." Outside, laughter echoed from the lawn where Caroline's friends practiced walking down the aisle. Their voices carried through the open windows, bright and careless. Caroline herself stood at the veranda giving instructions to the decorators, her gown half finished, her hair pinned in pearls. The breeze caught her words, commands disguised as pleasantries. "Make sure the ribbons are ivory, not cream. Cream looks poor in sunlight," she said. Brutus listened without turning his head. He had learned every cadence of her voice, every tremor of pride or irritation. He could tell when she was pleased, when she was angry, when she was remembering the past even though she pretended she had forgotten it. Today her tone was brittle. Perfection was her shield. The rest of the household fluttered around her like moths. Master Ashford, now stooped with age, inspected the wine shipment. The pastor rehearsed the vows in the parlour. Florists filled the halls with lilacs until the air itself seemed drunk on their sweetness. Brutus inhaled the scent and felt it coat his tongue, a sweetness too rich, almost cloying. He returned to the kitchen and began assembling the layers of the cake. The ingredients gleamed before him like instruments of ceremony, flour sifted fine as dust, eggs gathered at dawn, sugar sparkling like frost. His hands moved with the memory of every feast he had ever made. Yet today each gesture felt heavier, slower, sacred. One of the maids approached timidly. "Mr. Brutus, Miss Caroline asked how long the cake will take." He looked up, his eyes unreadable. "Tell her it will be ready when it should be," he said. The girl bobbed her head and fled. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily toward noon. In that rhythm, Brutus found a strange calm. Around him, the kitchen hummed with ordinary life laughter, the scrape of ladles, the ring of knives, but in his mind it all receded to a low drone. He saw only what lay ahead, the ceremony, the feast, the moment when every smile would freeze under the weight of his truth. By midday, the air outside shimmered with heat. Guests began to arrive in carriages that gleamed like polished obsidian. Their boots thudded on the gravel, their laughter floated through the open doors. Brutus caught glimpses of parasols, lace, and gloved hands. The plantation had never looked grander. Its wealth shone like armor. Caroline swept into the kitchen once more, her gown trailing like smoke. "Everything perfect?" she asked. "As you requested, Miss Caroline." She surveyed the trays of pastries, the simmering pots, the rows of chilled bottles. "Father says you're the pride of this household. Imagine a slave's hands preparing the meal of the year." Brutus bowed slightly. "Yes, miss." She tilted her head, studying him. "You never smile, Brutus, even today." He met her eyes just long enough for her to flinch. "Some things aren't for smiling, miss." She laughed, too loudly, and turned away. "Just see that the guests are pleased." When she was gone, the kitchen felt colder despite the heat. Brutus exhaled slowly, returning to his work. As the afternoon waned, the sky bruised with clouds. The ceremony began in the garden, a white archway, strings of lilac, the murmur of vows carried on the breeze. Brutus stood at the window watching. Caroline looked radiant, every inch the image of grace she had crafted. Her groom, Thomas Redding, smiled with the confidence of a man marrying into greater fortune. For a brief, impossible moment, Brutus wondered if he envied them their freedom to speak, to dream, to walk unshackled beneath the open sky. Then he remembered the firelight reflected in a child's eyes, and the envy turned to iron. Back in the kitchen, the final touches of the feast came together. He arranged platters like offerings: roasted quail, honey-glazed ham, corn pudding, pies heavy with fruit. Servants carried them to the tables outside where music and laughter swelled. Brutus followed last, bearing the cake himself, veiled in white icing, adorned with sugared violets. The guests applauded its beauty. "Magnificent!" someone cried. Caroline beamed, proud of the display, proud of the cook who had made it. She did not notice the stillness in his eyes, nor the way he lingered for a breath longer before setting the cake down. When the toast began, Brutus stepped back into the shadow of the veranda. The sun dipped low, painting the world in amber and blood. He watched them raise their glasses, his master, his mistress, the gathered nobility, and he felt the years coil inside him, tightening until they hummed like a string ready to snap. One of the younger servants touched his arm. "Mr. Brutus, you all right?" He nodded once, just watching. "Big day, huh?" Brutus's gaze never left the table. "The biggest." The boy laughed and ran off, leaving him alone with the wind and the sound of distant applause. He could almost hear his family then, the faint echo of their voices through the noise of celebration. They were not pleading, not sorrowful, only waiting. The waiting was what burned most. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, just as it had the night before. The first drops of rain spattered the veranda railing, dissolving the sugar dust on his hands. He lifted them, studying the way the sweetness melted under the water. "Everything returns to the earth," he whispered. Behind him, the band struck a jubilant tune. Caroline and her new husband twirled across the lawn as the guests clapped in rhythm. The feast continued, oblivious. Brutus turned from the window and began clearing the dishes that would soon come back half-eaten, his movements precise, ritualistic. The storm rolled closer, and in its shadow his calm deepened into something almost serene. For 14 years the fire inside him had waited. Tonight it would finally find its light. The great hall of the Ashford estate had never looked so magnificent. Chandeliers blazed like captured suns, scattering diamonds of light across crystal and porcelain. Outside, the June afternoon shimmered with golden warmth, and a soft breeze moved through the tall windows like a blessing. Caroline Ashford, soon to be Caroline Hartwell, stood at the center of it all, radiant in a gown of ivory lace and pearls. Her laughter rose above the chatter of the gathered guests, the sound clear, musical, and utterly confident in its command of the world. I watched from the shadows at the edge of the room, standing by the service table, my white apron spotless, my hands folded neatly before me. The wedding feast had been served and received with admiration. Platters of roasted fowl, silver dishes of buttered vegetables, tureens of soups perfumed with herbs, all of it prepared by my hands. I had played my part to perfection, as always. The guests had praised my work, unaware that every compliment was a blade turned inward, sharpening my resolve. At the head table, Master Ashford sat beaming, his chest puffed with pride. Senator William Hartwell, tall, handsome, the very picture of Southern nobility, rested his hand over Caroline's. They looked like a painting come to life, the union of beauty and ambition, of wealth and lineage. Every guest saw in them a vision of the South's bright future. I saw only the past burning behind their smiles. Music drifted through the room, a string quartet, playing something delicate and fashionable. The air smelled of roses and candle wax, and beneath it all, the faint sweetness of the cake that waited near the far wall. It gleamed beneath its veil of lace and flowers, 5 perfect layers of white and pastel, adorned with sugar blossoms so real they seemed to breathe. The guests had been whispering about it all afternoon, marveling at its beauty. A true masterpiece, one woman said, fanning herself. The finest cake in Virginia. I bowed slightly when her eyes met mine. "Thank you, ma'am," I murmured, my voice calm and smooth. Every moment that passed brought me closer to the end of a road 14 years long. I could feel the weight of time pressing on my chest, hear the echo of a child's scream that no music could drown out. I thought of Celia's gentle hands, of Samuel's laughter, of Ruth's tiny feet stumbling across the cabin floor. I had carried them here with me into this hall of marble and silver, into the heart of the world that had destroyed them. When the speeches began, I slipped quietly to the sideboard where the wine glasses waited. My fingers were steady. My expression never changed. The senator raised his glass first, his voice rich and confident as he spoke of love, of destiny, of the bright future that awaited him and his bride. The guests applauded with polite delight. Then Master Ashford stood, his voice trembling with paternal pride as he spoke of his daughter, the light of his life, the jewel of his home. He said her kindness had no equal, her spirit no fault. I felt the corner of my mouth twitch, but I kept my eyes lowered. Then came the bride herself. Caroline rose from her seat, her eyes shining, her cheeks flushed with happiness. The room fell silent, every guest hanging on her words. "My dear friends," she began, her voice graceful and sweet, "I stand before you the happiest woman in the world. My heart is full of gratitude, of joy, of hope." She turned her gaze to her father. "Papa, everything I am, I owe to you." She looked to her new husband. "And everything I will become, I owe to the man who has chosen to share my life." Her words were perfect, practiced, charming. She spoke as one born to command hearts. But I heard none of the sincerity the others heard. All I heard was the echo of her laughter in the firelight. All I saw was her face shining with joy as my world turned to ash. I clenched my hands behind my back until the nails bit my palms. The pain steadied me. When she lifted her glass for the final toast, the room held its breath. "To love everlasting," she declared, "to family, and to God's blessings that make this day possible." Her voice trembled slightly on the last words, not with emotion, but with the strain of perfection. The guests echoed her cheer, the crystal of 100 glasses catching the light like captured stars. Then came the thunder. It rolled across the fields outside, distant at first, then nearer, deeper, a long, shuddering growl that made the chandeliers quiver. The guests murmured, startled but amused. "A wedding blessed by heaven," someone said. Caroline laughed, a bright silver sound that filled the hall. "Let the skies celebrate with us," she cried. But when she laughed, lightning flashed behind her through the tall windows, turning her white gown momentarily blood-red in the reflection. No one else seemed to notice. The rain began soon after, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on the roof like the beating of distant drums. Servants hurried to close the windows. The scent of wet earth mingled with roses and wine. I stood still, my eyes on the cake, listening to the storm grow. At last, Master Ashford clapped his hands. "My friends," he called, "it is time for the centerpiece of this glorious day, the wedding cake." Applause rippled through the hall. Caroline clapped her hands together like a child. "Oh yes, bring it forth." I nodded to the waiting servants. Together, we lifted the masterpiece onto the serving cart and wheeled it to the head table. Gasps of admiration filled the room as I removed the silk covering. The cake seemed to glow under the chandeliers, its 5 tiers rising like an altar to some sweet, terrible god. Caroline's eyes shone. "Brutus," she said, "you've outdone yourself. It's breathtaking." I bowed. "Thank you, Miss Caroline. I'm honored." The guests gathered close, their laughter and chatter mingling with the rumble of thunder outside. Cameras clicked the new daguerreotype devices, cumbersome but miraculous. They wanted to capture perfection, to freeze this moment forever. "Would you do the honors, my dear?" Master Ashford asked, handing Caroline a silver knife. She nodded, taking it with a graceful smile. The guests leaned forward eagerly as she placed her hand atop her husband's. Together they pressed the blade through the top tier. The hall erupted in cheers and applause. I stood perfectly still, watching her face. She turned toward me briefly, her blue eyes shining. "Thank you again, Brutus," she said softly, almost kindly. "You've given me the perfect day." Another thunderclap shook the windows, louder this time. The lights flickered. Somewhere outside, a horse neighed nervously, and for one fleeting instant, the scent of smoke seemed to drift through the hall, not from fire, but from memory. My throat tightened. I could almost hear the crackle of flames, the screams carried on the wind. The guests began to sing a wedding song, cheerful and foolish. I barely heard it. My gaze was fixed on the storm outside, on the dark clouds gathering over Virginia like judgment itself. Lightning flared again, lighting the room in stark white. Every smiling face froze in that light, beautiful, proud, unaware. As the guests reached for their glasses once more, I stepped back into the shadows. My work was done. Whatever followed now belonged to time and to fate. I felt the first deep tremor of release in my chest, not joy, not triumph, but something quieter. Resolution. The thunder rolled again, longer, heavier, until it seemed to shake the foundations of the old house. The storm had come to Ashford Plantation, and it would not leave unchanged. The storm outside swelled into a roaring ocean of wind and thunder. Rain slashed against the high windows of the Ashford estate, the sound like furious applause from the heavens themselves. Yet inside, laughter still reigned. The guests refused to let the weather dampen their spirits. The band played louder, the candles blazed brighter, and the clinking of glasses rang like bells of denial. I stood in the doorway that led to the servants' corridor, half in light, half in shadow, watching it all unfold. Caroline and her new husband danced under the chandeliers, her gown whirling like a ghost's shroud, his hand firm on her waist. Around them, the elite of Virginia toasted to their own endurance men who had built their fortunes on backs like mine, women who had smiled at cruelty as if it were grace. But their laughter could not drown the storm. The walls groaned under the force of the wind. A draught snuffed out 2 candles at the far end of the hall, and for a moment the air turned strangely cold. I saw Caroline glance toward the windows, unease flickering briefly in her eyes before pride returned to harden her face. She lifted her chin, smiled wider, and pulled her husband closer. I turned my gaze to the long table near the wall, the cake now cut, plates half-eaten, the frosting smudged. Guests reached for seconds, praising the flavor, the sweetness. Their voices floated through the air like faint echoes. They spoke of the future, of politics and trade, of the promise of the South reborn. No one noticed how pale Senator Hartwell had become. He was the first. He lowered his glass slowly, confusion crossing his face. His hand trembled slightly as he set it down, and he blinked as though trying to clear his vision. Caroline noticed at once and laughed softly. "Too much champagne, my love," she teased. He smiled weakly but did not answer. Then came the second Mrs. Langley, the banker's wife. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, murmuring something to her husband. "My head," she whispered. "So dizzy." The music faltered as more guests began to shift in their seats, murmuring to one another. A few laughed nervously, assuming it was the wine or the heat. The air had grown thick and stifling, the scent of sugar and roses turning strangely heavy. Master Ashford rose, frowning. "Is everyone quite well?" he called, his voice commanding, fatherly. A sound answered him, soft at first, then sharper, a glass shattering against the floor. Senator Hartwell had collapsed forward, his chair clattering behind him. Gasps filled the room. Caroline screamed, rushing to his side. "William," she cried, shaking him. "William, speak to me." Panic rippled through the hall. Servants darted forward, uncertain and terrified. Guests rose, their laughter gone, their eyes wide. Some began to cough, Others clutched at their stomachs. Mrs. Langley fell next, then another man near the window, his face turning grey as ash. The music died. Only the thunder spoke. Now. I remained still, my back straight, my face expressionless. My heart beat slow and steady, every sound in the room ringing sharp and clear in my ears. Caroline's cries grew louder, more frantic. "Father, help me! He's not breathing!" Master Ashford stumbled toward her, confusion and fear twisting his features. "Fetch a doctor!" he shouted, his voice cracking. Now! But the doctor was already there among the guests, Dr. Pembroke, a man known for his arrogance and skill. He knelt beside the fallen senator, pressed his fingers to the man's throat, then looked up. His eyes were wide. "He's gone," he said hoarsely. "Dear God, he's gone." The words fell like stones into a silent pond. Caroline froze. Her hand still clutched her husband's arm. For a moment she did not move, did not even breathe. Then she screamed a sound so piercing it made the chandeliers tremble. "No! No, he can't be! Someone help him!" Her voice broke as she looked around, wild and desperate. "Do something!" she cried. Someone do something. But no one moved, because now others were falling. A man slumped against the table. A woman collapsed into her chair. The hall was filled with confusion, shouting, coughing. Dishes clattered, wine spilled, candles toppled. The once perfect scene of elegance and joy had become a grotesque theatre of ruin. Master Ashford turned toward me, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. "Brutus," he barked, pointing a shaking finger. "Bring water! Bring—" His voice caught, he staggered. His hand went to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I stepped forward quietly, my gaze never leaving his face. "Water!" he croaked again, but his knees buckled. He fell forward, striking the edge of the table before crumpling to the floor beside his son-in-law. Caroline screamed again, crawling toward her father, her gown dragged through spilled wine, her pearls snapping from her neck and scattering like tears across the floor. "Papa! Papa! Please!" Lightning flashed through the windows, bathing the hall in white light. In that instant, every face was visible, the terrified guests, the dying, the servants frozen in horror. And me, standing still, calm in the eye of the storm. She looked up at me then. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands shaking. "Help him," she whispered. "Please, Brutus, you have to help him." I took a slow breath. The storm outside howled through the cracks in the windows. "Do you remember the night of the fire, Miss Caroline?" I asked softly. Her eyes widened. What are you talking about?" "The night your father ordered the barn to be burned," I said. My voice was steady, quiet, but it carried through the hall. "The night he said he'd make an example of the runaways, do you remember?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. "The barn burned," I continued. "And so did my family." Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by horror. "No," she breathed. "You—" I took a step closer. "I told you once I'd never forget, Miss Caroline. I never did." She scrambled backward, shaking her head. "You poisoned us?" Her voice broke. You devil!" Thunder shook the house again, drowning her words. Rain streamed down the windows like tears from heaven. I looked at her not with anger, not even with triumph, only a weary, hollow sorrow. "No, Miss Caroline," I said quietly. "Not the devil, just a man remembering his dead." Her sobs filled the room. The guests lay scattered around her, motionless. The servants huddled near the doors, some praying, some staring in disbelief. I turned toward the great window. Lightning flickered again, illuminating the storm's fury. The world outside was washed clean, every trace of dust and decay swept away by the rain. Behind me, Caroline crawled forward, her voice hoarse. "Why?" she whispered. "Why? Did you have to—" I looked over my shoulder, meeting her eyes one last time. "Because you never stopped," I said. "Because you built your happiness on graves." The wind tore through the hall, slamming the doors open. Candles went out in a rush of darkness. For a moment, the thunder drowned every sound, every breath. When the light returned, I was gone, swallowed by the storm. The guests who survived would tell stories for years. Some said the storm had cursed the wedding. Others whispered that the devil himself had walked among them. But the truth was simpler. Justice had come, quiet and patient, dressed in a servant's apron. And somewhere in the distance, under the cover of rain and thunder, I walked into the night, leaving behind the ashes of celebration. The plantation was a hive of activity, oblivious to the quiet storm that had been meticulously brewing for 14 long years. I moved with a precision born of habit, honed over countless hours of secret planning. Every detail of Caroline Ashford's wedding, from the cutlery to the tablecloths, had been accounted for, measured and rehearsed in my mind until it was as familiar as my own heartbeat. Today, the plantation's opulence, the grand chandeliers, the polished silver, the ornate lace was not a display of wealth or pride, but a stage. Every smile, every polite toast, every whispered compliment about the cake would be observed, catalogued, and turned to advantage. I lingered in the kitchen, my hands dusted with flour, my sleeves rolled up to the elbows as I arranged the final touches. The cake sat in the center of the table, a five-tiered marvel of confectionery perfection. Each layer had been infused with my deadly secret, the belladonna carefully ground, measured, and incorporated in a way that would ensure both its subtlety and effectiveness. The chocolate ganache, glossy and dark as midnight, concealed the poison completely. Not even the sharpest-tongued guest would suspect anything amiss. I had calculated everything: the number of slices, the amount each guest would likely consume, even the speed with which the poison would act. Timing was everything, and I had spent years perfecting it. As the first guests began arriving, their laughter and chatter drifting from the garden, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and serenity. My pulse was steady, my mind clear. I had long ago made peace with what I was about to do, the final act of vengeance that would honor the memory of Celia, Samuel, and little Ruth. I allowed myself a brief glance at my reflection in the polished silver tray. The face staring back was older than my years, hardened and weathered by grief and rage, but it was a face capable of seeing justice done. The garden was alive with celebration. Caroline Ashford moved with her usual elegance, radiant in her white silk gown trimmed with French lace. Her smile was effortless, her blue eyes sparkling in the afternoon sunlight as she greeted guests and accepted their compliments. For 14 years, she had escaped the consequences of her crime. For 14 years, she had lived in a cocoon of privilege, her wealth and status shielding her from the truth. Today, that cocoon would be pierced. Today, she would confront the consequences she had evaded for so long. I observed her from the kitchen window as she took her father's arm to walk down the aisle. The guests' applause echoed in the garden, a symphony of ignorance that played across my ears like a distant drum. Caroline's beauty, her charm, her ability to command the attention of everyone in the room, all of it was a mask. Behind it was the same girl who had set fire to my home, who had watched my family burn with a cruel curiosity that was unmatched in its coldness. I had replayed that night in my mind countless times, the crackling of the flames, the smell of smoke and burning wood, the terrified cries of my children. That memory had been the foundation of my purpose, the reason for every calculated step I had taken since. The cake's presentation was imminent. Master Ashford himself entered the kitchen to inspect my work. His eyes widened at the sight of the confection, gleaming with pride and satisfaction. "Magnificent, Brutus," he said, his tone filled with genuine admiration. "This will be the talk of Virginia society for years to come." I inclined my head respectfully, the practiced deference of a servant masking the storm inside me. "Thank you, sir. I wanted today to be perfect for Miss Caroline." "Perfect indeed," he murmured, oblivious to the hidden purpose of my perfection. I wheeled the cake to the reception tent, ensuring every movement was graceful and deliberate. The guests gasped collectively as the masterpiece was revealed, its 5 layers rising like a monument to culinary artistry. Caroline's eyes lit up, and she gasped in delight, unaware that her joy would soon turn to horror. The irony of her praise, the way she lavished compliments on my creation, made me bite my tongue to keep from smiling. I had always given her what she wanted. Today would be no exception. The first slice was hers. I handed her the silver knife, my hand steady, my expression calm. "I hope it tastes as good as it looks," I said, my voice betraying nothing. "It will, Brutus," she replied, her smile radiant. "You've never disappointed me." Her words were a bitter echo, for she had never truly known the meaning of my patience or my anger. She had never understood the depth of the debt she owed. Today she would. She cut into the chocolate layer, revealing the dark interior, and took the first bite. The poison, carefully calculated for dosage and timing, began its silent work. Within an hour, she would be suffering, her body racked by symptoms that mirrored the terror she had inflicted on my family. The guests, none of whom suspected a thing, continued their polite conversation, oblivious to the tragedy that had been set in motion. I slipped away during the initial rounds of dessert, leaving the chaos to unfold. My departure had been planned with equal care. I collected my few personal belongings: Celia's hand-carved cross, a letter she had dictated years ago, small keepsakes that tied me to the memory of my family. Each item was a tangible reminder of the lives I had lost, of the justice I had come to deliver. The Virginia countryside stretched before me as I walked to the grove of oak trees, the site I had chosen for my final act. The rope was ready, the branch sturdy. I had ensured that my exit would be as precise as the culmination of my revenge. I paused for a moment, inhaling the late afternoon air, letting the breeze carry away the tension I had carried for years. Every step I had taken, every meal prepared, every silent observation and calculation had led to this. At the oak grove, I prepared the noose, checking and rechecking the knot. My mind wandered briefly to Caroline, to the first bite of cake she had taken, and to the slow, inevitable process that would follow. Belladonna was merciless, attacking her nervous system and organs with a precision I had spent years mastering. I felt no regret, only a profound sense of completion. The fire that had consumed my home, my wife, my children, had finally found its echo in the lives of those responsible. I stepped onto the crate beneath the branch, the rope settling around my neck. The world below seemed still, silent, except for the rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of the plantation celebration. I closed my eyes, thinking of Celia, Samuel, and little Ruth. The memory of their faces gave me strength, as it had for 14 years. My last conscious thought was a quiet promise kept, a debt repaid with precision and patience. With a final step, gravity took over. My body swung gently in the warm evening air, the rope tightening as the light dimmed beneath the canopy of oaks. A strange serenity filled me as darkness approached, a peace I had not known since that night of fire. The scales had been balanced. Justice, long denied by law and society, had been delivered in full. The first sign that something was wrong came almost exactly 93 minutes after Caroline Ashford had taken her first bite of the chocolate layer. At first, the symptoms were subtle, easily dismissed as the effects of the Virginia heat or the indulgence of champagne and sweets. Mrs. Elizabeth Fairfax, an elderly woman married to a prominent Richmond banker, swayed slightly in her chair, her hand pressed to her forehead. Her face, pale beneath carefully applied rouge, carried a flicker of confusion. "I feel quite dizzy," she murmured to her husband, her voice tentative, uncertain. He assumed it was fatigue or perhaps too much sundae. He could not have known that her consumed cake was already coursing with the poison I had infused so meticulously. Within minutes, the subtle unease spread. Judge Harrison Blackwood, portly and authoritative, complained of blurred vision and a metallic taste in his mouth. The symptoms escalated rapidly, spreading from the first few individuals to nearly every guest who had consumed the cake. Young Margaret Sinclair, barely 18, laughed uncontrollably, her pupils dilated and black, the hallucinatory effects of the belladonna beginning to take hold. Laughter turned to shrieks as the body convulsed, and the hallucinatory visions worsened, blending reality with imagined horrors. But Caroline's collapse was the most telling, the most dramatic. She had been dancing with Senator Hartwell, her gown swirling like a tide of white silk, when she suddenly stopped mid-step, her eyes widening with disbelief. "William," she said, her voice carrying across the tent despite a strange, dreamy cadence. "Why do you have three faces? And why are they all spinning?" Her words were incoherent, a terrifying mix of hallucination and panic. Hartwell, now affected by the poison himself, stumbled to her side, his own features twisted by confusion, flushed skin, and involuntary tremors. The gathered crowd, once a chorus of polite laughter and chatter, descended into chaos. The revelry dissolved into a nightmare of gasps, cries, and screams. Dr. Marcus Webb, the plantation physician, pushed through the crowd, his medical instincts immediately recognizing the classic symptoms of severe plant poisoning. "Step back," he barked, authority cutting through panic. "Give them air. Keep them calm. Who ate the cake?" It took only moments for the truth to become apparent. Every single person displaying symptoms had consumed the wedding cake. Those who had abstained, either politely declining or simply ignoring the dessert, remained unaffected, seated in their perfect ignorance of the disaster unfolding around them. The beautiful confection that had been the centerpiece of Caroline's reception, admired and praised only moments ago, revealed itself as an instrument of calculated vengeance. Master Ashford, standing in the middle of the chaos, his face a mask of shock and horror, sought understanding. "What is happening?" he shouted, his voice breaking as he surveyed the flailing, convulsing, and hallucinating guests. "Dr. Webb, this is your doing. Tell me what is happening." Dr. Webb shook his head, a pall of grim authority settling over him. "They've been poisoned," belladonna. The symptoms: dilated pupils, hallucinations, rapid heartbeats, convulsions, classic signs. But the onset timing and the fact that it's restricted to those who ate the cake makes it indisputable. Caroline's delirium intensified. Her hands flew to her throat, voice cracking. My throat, my heart. It's like thunder. William, can't hear it. Senator Hartwell, already weakened, struggled to support her, his own body succumbing to the chemical assault. Dr. Webb's instructions grew frantic. He ordered servants to fetch water, induce vomiting, and do anything to counteract the poison, but it was already too late for many. The belladonna had entered their bloodstream, attacking nerve endings, vital organs, and the very rhythm of life itself. Caroline's last moments were a tragic blend of hallucination and memory, her guilt and fear magnified by the drug's cruel mechanics. "I can see them," she whispered suddenly, her voice eerily clear in the brief clarity that often precedes death. "The children, in the fire, calling for me." Master Ashford felt his heart seize in his chest. "What children, Caroline? What are you saying?" "They're angry. They want me to burn with them." "It's my turn now," she replied, voice quivering, eyes wide, staring at visions only she could see. It was then that the full tragic circle became horrifyingly clear to those who could comprehend. The ghosts of my children, Celia, Samuel, and little Ruth, had come for retribution. Caroline had murdered them, watched them die in flames without intervention, and now, in her final moments, she faced the reckoning that life had deferred for 14 long years. Her body succumbed first. At precisely 6:47 p.m., 4 hours and 12 minutes after consuming the fatal slice, Caroline Ashford's chest rose and fell for the final time. Her death was followed 23 minutes later by Senator Hartwell, his larger body resisting the poison longer, but ultimately surrendering to the systemic failure imposed by the belladonna. The reception tent, once filled with music and laughter, now resembled a scene from hell. 7 were dead. Others struggled for life, writhing, vomiting, convulsing, their breaths shallow and erratic. Dr. Webb, overwhelmed and exhausted, could only do what little he could to alleviate their suffering, but the damage had been done. The scale of retribution, perfectly calibrated to the crimes committed 14 years prior, had left no room for mercy. Meanwhile, I had already left, walking through the Virginia countryside toward my chosen oak grove. Each step was deliberate, carrying with it the weight of years of preparation and grief. I carried my few personal possessions, tangible links to the family whose lives had been stolen. Celia's wooden cross, a small canvas bag containing letters and keepsakes, each imbued with memory and mourning. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the fields, foretelling the end of one chapter and the absolute fulfillment of my long-deferred vengeance. By the time the search for me began in earnest, I was already at the oak grove, my final resting place chosen with care. The rope was ready, the branch secure, my exit as meticulously planned as the poison that had already enacted justice. I prepared the noose with precision, double-checking every knot. My thoughts wandered to the faces of my children, the memory of the fire, the injustice that had festered for over a decade. This, I reflected, was the culmination of 14 years of grief, planning, and patience. Every decision, every observation, every silent hour spent in planning had led inexorably to this moment. Stepping onto the crate beneath the oak, I felt a serenity that belied the chaos I had left behind. The world below, vibrant and oblivious, seemed far away, a stage on which my final act had already unfolded. I closed my eyes, imagining the faces of Celia, Samuel, and Ruth smiling, finally at peace, knowing that the debt had been repaid. The rope settled around my neck, tight and unyielding. With a final step, gravity claimed me, and I swung gently in the warm evening breeze, the world fading into darkness. Above me, the plantation erupted in frantic action, screams mingling with the sounds of gasping breaths, the shuffle of servants and doctors trying desperately to save those still alive. Yet in the midst of that chaos, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. The debt had been repaid. Justice, long denied by society and law, had been served with exactitude. Caroline Ashford, the woman who had destroyed my family, had been confronted by the consequences of her own cruelty. The scale had been balanced, and my family's memory honored in the most absolute way possible. The morning after the Ashford wedding massacre dawned not with birdsong and sunlight, but with an uncanny silence that blanketed the Virginia countryside. Mist hung over the plantation fields like a burial shroud, veiling the devastation that had unfolded the night before. The once celebrated Ashford estate, symbol of southern wealth, pride and power, now stood desecrated by death and scandal. The bodies were discovered at dawn, sprawled in grotesque stillness beneath the grand white tent that had hosted their final celebration. Servants whispered prayers and crossed themselves as they gathered near the edges, unwilling to step too close. The sweet scent of the remaining cake mingled with the acrid stench of vomit, blood, and panic that still clung to the air. Dr. Marcus Webb was still there, his coat stained, his eyes hollow. He had not slept. His trembling hands clutched a notepad filled with frantic medical notes, but even his training could not rationalize the sheer magnitude of what had occurred. 9 dead, he muttered under his breath, his voice a dull echo of disbelief. 9 dead from the same dish, all from the same cursed cake. Among the dead lay Caroline Ashford, her once radiant face slack and pale. Her wedding gown, now soiled and torn, clung to her like a ghost's shroud. The pearls around her neck had snapped during her convulsions, and the beads lay scattered around her, a cruel mockery of the life she had just begun. Nearby, Senator Hartwell's body lay twisted, his hand still clutching hers, a tableau of devotion turned to ruin. By mid-morning, word had spread across the county. Riders galloped down dirt roads toward neighboring plantations, carrying news of the Ashford tragedy. By noon, the Richmond Gazette had already dispatched a correspondent, and the story began to take on a mythic quality, whispers of curses, revenge, and divine retribution. Sheriff Alcott arrived just before midday, flanked by 2 deputies. He was a hard man, used to violence, but even he hesitated as he surveyed the carnage. "God Almighty," he whispered. "Looks like the devil himself passed through here." The investigation began immediately. The remaining food was gathered and tested by crude methods available at the time. Animals fed bits of the cake convulsed and died within hours, confirming the obvious. Deliberate poisoning. Suspicion turned instantly toward the enslaved servants, for in the twisted logic of the antebellum South, guilt always descended first upon the lowest. One by one, the house servants were brought in for questioning. Fear gripped every face. They knew the stakes. But there was one name that rose again and again: Samuel, the quiet baker who had worked in the kitchens for years, who had baked the cake with his own hands. Yet when the sheriff ordered him brought forward, none could comply. He was gone. By evening, a search party was organized. Lanterns bobbed through the darkening woods as dogs were unleashed to follow his scent. They traced it for miles, leading away from the estate, through dense thickets, and finally toward the grove of oaks that overlooked the river. There, beneath the largest and oldest tree, they found him. Samuel hung from the branch, motionless, swaying gently in the twilight breeze. His feet were bare, his clothes were neat, as if he had dressed for an occasion. In one hand, tied to his wrist by a thin strip of cloth, was a small bundle, letters, drawings and keepsakes of 3 children, Celia, Samuel Jr., and Ruth. The other hand clutched a simple wooden cross, worn smooth from years of touch. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sheriff removed his hat, his weathered face tight with something between respect and dread. "Cut him down," he finally said. "The man's done his reckoning." When they searched the area, they found more. A carefully written letter placed in a tin box beneath the roots of the oak. It was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Sheriff Alcott opened it, his eyes moving across the neat, deliberate handwriting. The words were neither hysterical nor vengeful. They were calm, eerily so. "My name is Samuel Reed. 14 years ago, my wife and children were burned alive in the Ashford fire, a fire set by Caroline Ashford and her mother to punish my wife for defiance. They called it justice. The world called it an accident. I have lived each day since in silence, waiting for the Lord or man to bring justice. Neither did. So I have done what must be done. I have taken from them as they took from me. I have balanced the weight. Let history call me what it will. I go now to join my family. My soul is clean." The sheriff read the note twice before folding it silently. He said nothing to the deputies, only ordered them to bury Samuel beneath the oak. "He won't hang from a tree any longer," he muttered. "Let him rest with his truth." But truth, as always, is never still. Within weeks, newspapers across Virginia and the broader South exploded with headlines: "Wedding Day Massacre, Slave Baker Poisons 9 at Ashford Estate." Each publication offered its own version. Some painted Samuel as a deranged fanatic, driven mad by grief. Others, particularly abolitionist presses up north, portrayed him as a tragic avenger, a man forced into monstrous justice by a monstrous world. His name became legend, whispered in kitchens and cotton fields across the south. The Ashford estate fell into ruin within a year. The surviving family, shunned by neighbors and crippled by scandal, sold the property at a fraction of its worth. The grand plantation house, once teeming with laughter and guests, stood abandoned by the decade's end, its walls crumbling, its gardens overgrown with weeds. Locals swore they could still hear faint music drifting through the trees at night, and sometimes the sound of children's laughter followed by sudden silence. As for the oak grove, it became a site of quiet pilgrimage among the enslaved. They left tokens there, small crosses, broken toys, carved initials, offerings to Samuel Reed and the family he avenged. Over time, his story passed into oral tradition, told in whispers and fireside tales. Mothers would tell their children, "Don't forget the man who made the masters remember." By 1863, when the war reached Virginia, Union soldiers camped near the ruins of Ashford Hall. One of them, a young black man from Massachusetts, found the tin box buried under the oak, the letter still intact. The ink faded but legible. He read it by lantern light and, according to his journal, wept openly. He carried it north after the war, and it would later appear in a small abolitionist pamphlet titled Voices of the Silenced. Generations later, historians would debate Samuel's legacy. Some called him a murderer, others a martyr. But among the descendants of those once enslaved on the Ashford plantation, he was remembered differently, not as a villain or saint, but as a man who refused to let evil pass unpunished. A man who, when faced with a world deaf to justice, spoke in the only language that world understood. In time, the oak tree under which he hung came to be called the Tree of Reckoning. It still stood, weathered but alive, its roots deep and its branches wide. Locals avoided it after dark, but every few years, someone would leave a small token there, a sign that Samuel's story, though buried, had never truly died. And on certain nights when the air was still and the moonlight silvered the fields, those who believed claimed to see figures beneath the oak, a man standing tall beside 3 children, their hands clasped, their faces peaceful at last. The wind would pass through the branches, and it was said that if you listened closely, you could almost hear a whisper, "The debt is paid."